Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar about the open solar contracts. This webinar is brought to you by SolarPower Europe. My name is Mate Heiss. I'm head of international cooperation at SolarPower Europe, and it is my honor today to introduce this webinar. The open solar contracts are a suite of standardized contracts developed by IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, together with the Terrawatt Initiative, and supported by a number of international law firms, associations and industry stakeholders, including SolarPower Europe. They are aimed at simplifying solar project development as well as financing solar projects around the world. And so with this, I would already like to hand it over to Jean-Pascal Famba, who is the Secretary General and spokesperson of the Terrawatt Initiative, who will give us an introduction to this webinar and also who will be the moderator and the host of today's webinar. So Jean-Pascal, over to you. It's good to have you here.
Hi, good afternoon. I hope you hear me well. So I'm Jean-Pascal Famba, Secretary General of Terrawatt Initiative and spokesperson of the organization, and we are very proud here to have you all today in this webinar. Very happy to share the work of the team that the team made for 4 years now. The team being the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and the Terrawatt Initiative, and law firms and SolarPower Europe working all together to build this suite of contracts, standardized contracts, which aim is to help everyone to make better work and faster and cheaper process in order to achieve what is the essence, probably, or one of the most important topic in this beginning of century, which is the energy transition. And as IRENA rightfully reminds in its communication nowadays, it's possible. I invite you to follow the hashtag "It's possible." Yes, we do believe that it's possible, but it requires a lot of work, among which the standardization of contracts, standardization of the practices that we are using to deploy massively solar power across the globe, especially in developing and emerging countries. This work is essential. And we took a first stab at it with IRENA and my fellow lawyers 4 years ago, and now it's I think time. We have launched these contracts in last June for international review, and now the review phase is over. I think it's time, and thank you, SolarPower Europe, for organizing the webinar. It's time for us to share the learnings of all this work and to disseminate the practices that we think are what can be best done in order to first reduce the costs of solar electricity and consequently enable the energy transition. But without further ado, I would like to hand the mic to Serkan. Serkan Atta is in charge of the program, among many other responsibilities at the International Renewable Energy Agency, the IRENA. Serkan, up to you.
Thank you, Jean-Pascal, for the introduction. Let me first extend my appreciation to SolarPower Europe, Mate and Lorena in particular, for organizing this webinar, and also to everyone online for attending. I am basically tasked with setting the scene for more technical presentations and discussions to follow. So I'm not planning to take too much of your time. I will only introduce the initiative in very broad terms and explain where we are in the process. And I should probably mention at the outset that I'm a bit under the weather today. Well, that's probably an understatement. I'm actually pretty sick. So I may need to sign out after my presentation. I apologize for that. But should you have any questions for me in particular or for the International Renewable Energy Agency, you can send me an email or to the generic email address that you will see on my final slide. So without further ado, let me start with the problem statement. Can you help me to move to the next slide, please? Wonderful, thank you. I think everyone online knows for a fact that the business case for renewables has never been stronger. Solar power in particular can now compete head-to-head with conventional power generation. With reference to IRENA's auction and PPA database, 83% of the solar PV project capacity due to be commissioned next year would generate cheaper electricity than any coal, oil, or natural gas option. And obviously, this is mainly driven by technological innovation. However, the innovation in technology has not translated into innovation in market practices for project development and finance. The prevailing market practices largely remain complex and cost-intensive, and this is mainly because they have been mostly inherited from large-scale and technically complex conventional power generation. Due to their highly intricate transaction structures and conventional power generation assets, typically required customized legal and financial solutions. And this has led to high transaction costs and prolonged project timelines, both of which could be tolerated for conventional power generation, given their large scale. However, renewables, wind and solar in particular, are typically smaller in scale. They're highly modular, intrinsically less complex, so traditional project development and finance practices have not worked for them. And smaller projects suffered the most since transactional processes and therefore costs are most effects. And putting all the money and time that need to go into project development, custom-made contractual solutions do not always guarantee bankability. And project developers typically do not realize that until they initiate their debt and equity raising campaign. And then it may seem to be too late. It's not always easy or even possible to go back and renegotiate your PPA, for instance. It is therefore very important to work with market-tested contractual documentation solutions to make sure that you will achieve financial closure and then COD. There are, of course, best practices and effective solutions to bankable contractual documentation. However, they mostly remain as one-off solutions and not replicated regionally or globally. So what needs to be done is to capture what works and then replicate it widely. And this is exactly where we are coming from. Building on the lessons learned in the last decade or so, we aim to identify more effective solutions to bankable contractual documentation. Let me, next slide, please. Thank you. And having worked with 11 top-tier law firms that you see on the screen, and also with SolarPower Europe for more than 3 years now, we are in a position to offer a real and practical solution to the whole solar power community, and that solution is open solar contracts. Open solar contracts present a standardized and simplified contractual suite, including templates for power purchase agreement, implementation agreement, supply and installation agreements, O&M agreement, and a financing facility term sheet. Together, these templates provide a full-blown, almost complete legal package, and they're open source, meaning that they can be downloaded, edited, and used freely. There are no strings attached. You can tailor the templates for specific jurisdictions and specific projects and use them in real transactions. So the product that we are offering to the global solar power community is standardized and simplified templates that you would need for developing and financing solar on-grid solar PV projects. So The details of each template will be presented shortly by JP. So let me just jump to the the objectives that we want to achieve with this initiative. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with a simplified and standardized contractual framework, we aim to reduce negotiations to a limited number of key and technical and financial terms, so all parties involved in a transaction can save considerable time and money. We also aim to decrease the cost of capital with a balanced risk allocation. By that, what I mean is open solar contracts systematically allocate the risks to the parties that are most able to manage them. And finally, by building on what has worked in project finance to this day, we aim to provide a bankable documentation solution and therefore achieve higher project realization rates. So it's just meaningless to try reinventing the wheel and start from scratch for every transaction. We are trying to capture the market consensus on what works for project finance and then disseminate it globally. We would like to particularly avoid cases where PPAs are signed but projects remain unimplemented due to failure to achieve financial closure. Next slide, please. And this would be my final. So here, let me briefly explain where we are in the process. The initiative, in fact, launched more than 2 years ago, and we have been working quite hard since then. But I'm not going to, of course, talk about what we have been doing over the last 36 or whatever months. Instead, I will concentrate on where we are today. And where we are today is actually very close to finalizing the documentation. We have the drafts ready, thanks to the law firms that were on my previous slide and to SolarPower Europe. And we have opened these drafts to an external review to collect feedback from the industry and make sure what we have is actually a well-balanced and universally applicable solution. During the review phase, we have received more than 1,600 responses from both public and private stakeholders. And now we are working on incorporating these comments into documentation. So all comments are given due consideration. You can find the draft contracts on Initiative's dedicated website, which is opensolarcontracts.org. And the final versions will be available on the same website by the end of this year or early next year. And the next phase would be when we have the final documentation, the next step would be to organize workshops and webinars to disseminate the contracts globally. IRENA, for those of you who are not familiar, has a near universal membership base. So we have 160 member states, and we will offer our support to them in adopting the documentation in their jurisdiction. And we are also very much open to engaging with the private sector as we do today. So if you have any questions or comments, if you'd like to know more, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us by just dropping an email to the email address that is on my final slides. Can we move to my next and final slide, please? Yes, so opensolarcontracts@irena.org and opensolarcontracts.twit. You can send an email to both, and we'll get back to you. And before I leave the virtual floor to Jean-Pascal, let me once again thank SolarPower Europe, Mate and Lorena, and to you once again. And let me also extend an open invitation to you all to check the initiative's website, where you can also find a guideline that would help you better understand the initiative in general and the contracts in particular. So that would be all for me. I might sign out shortly again, and my apologies for that. And thanks everyone for listening. JP, over to you.
Thank you very much, Serkan, and thank you for being here while you are sick. And I wish you a very swift recovery and to get well as soon as possible. You're absolutely indispensable to the initiative, and we need you back quick. I would like also to take the opportunity here to say that you can thank you for the attendees to join, and so who have joined in the meantime. Also, you can if you have questions about what just can say or what will be discussed afterwards, you are very welcome to and to make your to write down your questions. There is a little app on the GoToWebinar which enables you to ask your questions, and maybe Lorena, you can show the slide that shows a little bit how it works. It's very simple. If you have any questions, just ask, and if we can't answer, or if we don't have time to answer to these questions during the webinar, we'll make sure that no questions remain unanswered. Especially if you have questions for Serkan, who might leave us very soon. I will extend these questions to him so that he can reply swiftly as soon as back. I would like also to take this opportunity to make a little bit of advertising for an event that SolarPower Europe is going to host next month in London on the OAM practice, OAM and asset management event in London, and just to say that it's one of the main contract of the Open Solar Contract Suite is the OAM agreement, and has been designed in complete furtherance of the work of SolarPower Europe on OEM. And Mate, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's yours. You are now at your second best practice guidelines on the OEM, and this event will discuss the applications, the implementation of this best practice, and the emergence of new best practices. It's in London on 5 December, and you are very, very welcome to join. I have the task now to introduce briefly on what the Open Solar contracts are, in a little more details, in a little more legal details, I would say. I'm going to try to, next slide, please. Yes, and to discuss the assumptions, the features, and the general features of the contracts, and one specific point, which is the risk allocation in the PCOA, which is at the core of what we consider as the right and fair balance between the I would say private and public side, or the demand side and the supply side. So let's start by the assumptions. I think it's always important when we are drafting documentation that we are very clear on the assumptions that are underlying the drafting, and these assumptions are quite simple, but a little bit numerous. So next slide, please. So the basic assumptions are that the Open Solar contract would apply in contexts where there are clear public policies, and the large in favor of the large-scale deployment of solar power generation assets. You will see the SPGA acronym very often. It stands for Solar Power Generation Asset. Which is more specific than the generic work project, and the reason why is, and we use asset because it's a solar power generation is not only a project, it becomes an asset, and over the lifetime, it is and remain an asset, and from financial point of view, will be seen as an asset in which people invest. So there must be a clear policies. As long as there are no policies in a country, there are very limited chances that they reach viable projects at scale. Maybe you can find one or two, but it will be very difficult at the end of the day. It won't achieve what we think is I would say, the underlying principle of everything that we have done is, again, that the LCOE is as low as possible in order to enable access to affordable energy. So you need, but even if the policies are clear, you don't need necessarily to have a very strong regulatory framework. It's better, but we have assumed that it's not yet the case, and this is why, and this is the purpose of the implementation agreement, which is to compensate on the lacks of the regulatory framework. If the regulatory framework is top notch, if you allow me, then the need for an implementation agreement will be more and more limited. But the reality is, for the moment, that there are public policies, but they are very limited or inconsistent regulatory framework, which need to be enhanced. The third assumption is that we are working on a BOO basis, meaning that the asset is meant to be built, owned, and operated by an independent power producer, and it's not a public procurement of asset, it's a public procurement of energy. Next set of assumptions, it's linked to the structure. We assume that the project and the SPGA is borne by a project company, a special purpose vehicle, which has a limited liability company, which will exist from the start and can be the bidder or the applicant of in the power purchase process. The reason why for that is to avoid the transfer of license or on contracts or PPAs in the process, which are costly and create sometimes or very often legal uncertainties. And it's better to have, even if sometimes I understand it's not so easy, it's better to have a project company existing from the very beginning. And the other assumption is that we are working on a non-recourse finance and off-balance sheet financing, which means that, as you know, the key element for the lender will be the certainty of the cash flow generated by the asset, which is sometimes which the set of contracts, not only the set of contracts, but which a good set of contracts can really help to be comfortable with. The next set of assumptions is so the idea, the principle that the project company cash flow, which is so important, will result from a long-term PPA, as long as possible and as connected as possible with the lifetime of the asset. We didn't take a view in these assumptions on the way this contract, this PPA will be allocated. It can be an open, it needs to be an open and transparent process, but it can be a competitive process like reverse bidding, or it can be an administrative process like a FID program. The open solar contracts are neutral on this option that the governments have or the off-takers have under the regulations of the government. We have also made the assumption that the PPA is a take or pay type. Again, it's something which can be which is very frequent, and it is the one which allocates the risk of curtailment on the one not on the power producer who doesn't have any means to manage that. We have heard some remarks about that, saying that in the market we see more and more, especially when the governments have more bargaining power, more and more contracts where the curtailment risk is put on the power producer, which is completely possible, but it has immediately an impact on the cost of electricity, and it's not necessarily the best way to manage the grid, and because you build in the cost of the uncertainty of the grid over all the lifetime of the asset and the PPA, whereas it is very likely that at some point in this lifetime there will be better management of the grid, especially thanks to technology and storage, and that this cost would have disappeared. But that's up to the government to manage that. If they don't want to take or pay, it's a different kind of PPA. Some provisions need to be changed, but they built in. They need to be advised that if they do that, they built in a cost which over the lifetime, which is not necessarily their interest. What we also have said is that everything else than power that solar power generating asset can produce is not included in the scope of the open solar contracts. It can be either regulated or traded on a merchant basis. And what do I mean by that? I mean green certificates. I mean regulation of frequency. I mean all the ancillary services that the electronics in a solar park can provide to the grid, for instance, are things that are not included into the contracts. And we have also assumed that the buyer or the off-taker is a public or publicly owned entity or utility. But we wanted to point out that to a certain extent, it's also possible to imagine that the off-taker is any kind of private operator, a private off-taker, but in the context where it is authorized to do so by the government, because it will benefit from the PCOA. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them through the app. We have assumed, obviously, that it's a grid-connected asset. We think, however, that the open solar contracts can be adapted to an off-grid or microgrid project, provided that we can find bankable long-term off-takers and enter into with these off-takers a long-term PPA, which is for the moment very, very rare. We have also assumed that the grid infrastructure is the responsibility of the government or its agent, in particular the distribution or transmission operator. And we have also assumed that the grid arrangement, the grid connection arrangements, and as well as the willing agreements are also in place. And last set of assumptions that and that's a very big one. It happens in kind of a quite significant number of geographies, but not everywhere by far. We have assumed that the government will procure the provision of the site. which is a very strong assumption and has consequences on the allocation of risk about the site. But this this assumption is also made to draw the attention of the governments of the importance of not only the site but also the rights of way, easement, and other rights that are necessary for the project to be carried out. At some point, these assumptions will probably disappear unless the governments making their own calculation realize that they are better off and they will have better terms in financially speaking if they can provide a secured site with all the rights of way and easements that are necessary. We have assumed for the contract that the development is completed, that all the authorizations have been granted and are okay, and we have also assumed that the data room is organized, structured, and complete, which is all that the work of the developer, a party that we don't see in the contracts directly, but which, as you all know, is a key player in the system because it is the one that enables all the rest. So now let's see what are the key features of the open solar contracts under these assumptions. In a nutshell, I think what we can say. So you have here the drawing of the structure, and we saw at the center the project company and all the 6 agreements that we have drafted, and the counterparties that are around, and the work of the developer precisely is to make sure that these all contracts are well organized and well structured in order for every of the stakeholders around to be comfortable with the system and to get what they need to get the best of what they can get out of this set of arrangements. So what really, and as Serkan said earlier, what really we wanted to do is to capture what is we consider as being the consensus, or at least what most people think are best practices in a PV documentation, and to organize that in a simple manner. So that it can be used by everyone. Again, as I can say it as well, they are provided free of charge. So it's really the dissemination of what is best practice at the moment, or what can become really very soon best practices, because they reach, or they make possible reaching the goal of reducing drastically the costs of the solar power. So the way they are structured, and if you have downloaded the contracts, you can see it very clearly. They have been structured thinking about their digitalization at some point, and basically you have a core, the core of the contract, and that which is the program, I would say, and which is meant not to change or very limited manner by via the schedules, and the key information table, which includes all the commercial parameters that are the variables of the process, but don't have an impact on the structure itself. So we have structure that so that it's very easy to negotiate. So you have the table of the key information table, which are the negotiable parts of the contracts, and we have drafted it in plain English so that it's easier to read for everyone and it's not too lawyerish. It's there. We have split the installation, so the EPC into two contracts, and Brie can discuss that afterwards. And we have made it. We have taken all what we think it makes them bankable, and at the same time being sufficiently pro-government to be protective of the public interest, which are important, especially in countries where they feel that they often are the weaker party in the negotiation, and that also will help in the adoption by the public authorities of these contracts and then their applications in the future. I'm a little long, sorry for that, and yeah, I go a little faster. So we start by the implementation agreement. I think it's the fundamental contract in the system, which is granting the concession to operate the asset, and will provide, by which the government will provide the support for the permits and the development to the project company, and will allocate the risk over the lifetime of the asset, in particular through the PCOA, the put and call option agreement, which is becoming a quite common practice especially in developing and emerging countries. There's a huge question about their impact on the balance sheet of the government, but it creates, for the moment, quite a significant level of comfort with the other stakeholders, so that they are considered generally, when well drafted, bankable. Oops. The second contract on the top of the implementation agreement is the power purchase agreement. Again, same assumptions: single buyer, grid connected, take or pay. And we have made a lot of developments on the processes to be sure that the connection process and the start, the dim energy, and the start of the beginning of the cash flow in the process is secured, so that there is as limited risk as possible in the cash flows at the beginning, which has, as you know, a very important impact on the return, and as well, and the sizing of the reserves, which themselves have an impact on the return of the asset, and then makes the project bankable or not. That's for the I would say the demand side. The demand side being implementation agreement and PPA, so how the public is procuring energy in the country. And now the question is how the supply side will organize itself in order to achieve what is asked by the demand side. And so we have a supply agreement and an installation agreement, which are another way to make a split EPC. And again, I will let Brie comment on that during the discussion. The reason why we have split is mainly linked to an optimization that is allowed by the kind of technology that we use, in particular tax optimization, but also process and operational optimization, which makes a clear distinction between who is responsible to supply the equipment and who is responsible to install it, being understood that in solar, as you know, this installation is not a tenth of the overall cost, contrary to some other technologies. And once it's installed and commissioned, there is this very long period of the operation and maintenance. It's a very sensitive part of the life of the asset. It's the main part of the life of the asset. And we have developed, and Brie and Lizzie can talk in detail about that. Quite comprehensive and top of the game OEM contract based on the best practices that have been developed by industry in particular, and summarized very well summarized by SolarPower Europe in the best practice guideline. It includes additional services for additional fees, and there is a very clear and detailed spare parts regime, which is always in practice a long negotiation, even if it's not so important financially speaking. But there is always some tensions in this kind of negotiations, and it's important to have a clear and fair fair clauses on that. And to finish, I would like to point out that all that is meant to be bankable and to make the lenders happy. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to provide a full financing facility agreement, and we limited ourselves to a term sheet, which is a very extended term sheet. It can work in most of financing cases, even the more complex. It's probably to a certain extent a little too much, and probably there will be some parts which are not necessary in the day-to-day life, but we have preferred to have a comprehensive term sheet rather than go into the drafting of a detailed facility agreement. So I think I'm done for this part. I just wanted to briefly show what is in the PCOA, and not going into the details, but just really to say we have detailed clearly in the implementation agreement in what cases who had the right to buy and to sell the shares of the project company, so that if there is a problem at the end of the day, the government gets the asset and the operation of the asset, and indemnifies the owner and the lenders of the asset to a certain extent, depending on specific cases. So you have the cases on the left-hand side. You have the description of who has the right, the put or call options, as the case may be, and then you have the financial determinants of the price, of the purchase price of the shares, and all that goes in much more detail in the implementation agreement. But we really have taken a lot of time looking at this table, and especially at the purchase price, to find something which is fair and makes people comfortable, and it is also a kind of virtuous cycle generating provision, because when you have that, and when you have a lot of comfort from all the parties, especially the financiers, then the cost gets much lower, because the risk and the transaction costs are lower, and with the lower cost, the likelihood that the contract goes wrong it goes down as well. So it might sometimes be frightening or raising a lot of questions, but there is also in the philosophy of what we have done this view that the lower the cost of electricity is, not only it's good for the country and for the development of these countries or for the energy transition, it's also good for the overall stability of the system, because it creates more trust and less risk. Now I would like to first thank you for this. Sorry, for listening and start the discussion. I think we are really late, and I'm very sorry for that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Serkan is probably no longer with us, and thank you to him again for being here. Let me introduce you Elizabeth Reed, who is a partner at Bird & Bird, and who contributed the OEM agreement, and Bree Mitchell, who is a partner at Reed Smith and contributed to the supply agreement and installation agreement together with Covington. And last but not least, Stefano Mantelassi, who, and I will never be able to pronounce it with the very nice Italian accent that would be required, who is the Vice President of Energy Solution at ENI, and is also the chair of the Emerging Market Task Force at SolarPower Europe. Excuse me. Sorry. So maybe if you allow me, I would start with Stefano to have his general comments. Stefano, as the chair of the SolarPower Europe Emerging Market Task Force, can you share with us the difficulties that SolarPower Europe members are facing in emerging markets, and in your view, how can standard contracts can help to solve or to reduce these difficulties?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, here I am. Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal, and don't worry about the pronunciation of my family name. That was perfect. Okay, very quickly, as a SolarPower Europe representing the private sector, we think that the work that was done with the Open Solar contract was very important, and then it is our commitment to provide support to it and to make sure that a large number of actors in the sector can use it and can work with it. We have already, let's say, mentioned during your presentation what are the problems that we encounter as an industry in developing solar projects in emerging markets. I mean, there is not in general culture for renewable energy in general, which creates a lack of political framework and therefore a lack of a proper regulatory framework. There are technical aspects, access to the land, access to the grid, the fact that when there are tender process, these are not standardized, there is not a standard documentation for arriving at one of the most important issues, which is the how to provide the financial support to these projects in those countries, and to provide the risk mitigation tools. We know that the financial institutions have some programs, financial and political institutions have some programs that provide the support to the renewable energy business in emerging markets. But the support is more related towards the initial phase, maybe, of the project, support to sector studies for different countries, maybe financing or grant for pre-feasibility studies, but there is a lack of contribution in the most important phases of the project realization, which includes bidding procedures, tender award, preparation of project documentation, PPAs, guarantees, etc., etc. And it is in this space that we think the work that was done with the open solar contracts is very important, because having a standard documentation that it is recognized by all the stakeholders, the industry, the developers, the off-takers, the regulators, the financial institutions, creates the proper background and terrain for developing renewable energy projects. And this, I would say, mainly for three reasons, which is the fact that I mean, there is clarity on the risk allocation, which is very important for having a low cost of capital. Having documents already prepared, already drafted, who have only to be fine-tuned, allows to have a very quick negotiations. And then last but not least, of course, from a cost viewpoint, I mean, though having clear project documentation helps you to have a clear idea on economics on the project, on the return, therefore on the easiness of financing. And I mean, and of course, also, I mean, having short time for negotiations reduces the project costs overall. So, I mean, we're short of time. In summary, this is what I wanted to say, and thank you again for the work that you have done.
Thank you very much, Stefano. It was a pleasure to work with you also on all this and get your feedback and insights. Very precious. Bree, on your side, you focused on the supply and installation work and the coordination of both. Can you tell us briefly what are for you the benefits of the split contracts and how these split contracts are acceptable and bankable from lenders' perspective?
Thanks very much, Jean-Pascal. I guess as an initial comment, I'd like to say there's really nothing new about split contracting, but it is quite novel in the solar PV sector where the parties are unrelated. As everybody's been saying this evening, some of the key objectives, obviously, of the open solar contracts are to reduce transaction costs and to reduce procurement costs. When you contract under an EPC lump sum turnkey basis, there is a risk premium built into that price. There are also tax structuring reasons why related parties split their contracts as a pretty standard approach into onshore and offshore contracts. So what we're really doing as part of this suite of agreements and as part of also reducing transaction costs is to effectively structure the contracts in a way that they already have been being structured, but also contemplating that the parties may not be related. So parties no longer have to draft the split contracts themselves or enter into a separate subcontract with a local onshore civil electrical contractor to meet local content requirements and local capability requirements, etc. But why we think these could work, where in the past lenders have rejected unrelated parties under a split contracting approach for solar PV as not bankable, is that they have been structured very differently. We're not structuring them with simply an offshore supplier of modules and panels. and an onshore underfunded local contractor bearing the bulk of the risk in the delivery of the solar PV project. What we have, you might couch in terms of sort of an offshore sort of EPC minus type contractor, where you basically have a specialist contractor who takes responsibility for the procurement of all the equipment, the engineering of the project, and delivers sort of a ready-made kit to the owner, which is delivered onshore, and then the local party just does the very straightforward works onshore. And the allocation of risk under the supply contract and under the installation contract are reflective of that allocation. So while both those contractors take liability for delay liquidated damages, it's the supplier who's taking responsibility for the performance of the plant. They're taking responsibility that the plant achieves the minimum guaranteed capacity, achieves the performance ratio over the completion and over the early years of the plant, and they bear the risk of the plant being rejected and the costs involved in restoring the site if the performance guarantees aren't actually met. And that's all against a backdrop of, as people have already been describing, a very bankable suite of agreements. The way the open solar contracts sit compared to available power purchase agreements, implementation agreement, concession agreement, or lack thereof in many emerging markets at the moment is already much more IPP and contractor friendly than the structures that financial institutions have been grappling to come to terms with to actually achieve close on a lot of these deals. So I think it's going to be some of the other issues that have been discussed on the call already, issues with curtailment, lack of grid infrastructure. These are the issues that still really need to be resolved, more the practical ones than the actual documentation. The open solar contract suite of agreements works well and should be accepted by lenders.
Well, thank you very much, Bray. That's very, very clear, and in a sense, it reflects the a little bit IKEA nature of what is this industry about? Is buying something from a specialist at IKEA and having an installer coming to install it on the other hand, but everyone working well together. And on top of that, the banker is happy. Thank you very much, Brie. Elizabeth, you focused on the OEM and you have been working a lot with SolarPower Europe on the OEM questions. Can you tell us how the contracts fits into the suite? Because it's a very long-term contract compared to the other, and how does it work, complement with the SolarPower Europe OEM best practices?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone. Yeah, we led with SolarPower Europe the O&M work stream on this project. The O&M, as you say, is a longer-term contract for the operation and maintenance of the solar project, for a term to be specified in the contract, but really to match whatever the tenor of the debt is on that particular project, and it is envisaged generally that it will be a long-term contract that commences on COD. We worked hard to make sure that it fits in with the remaining suite of open solar contracts, so particularly with the supply and install work streams that Brie led and was just describing, so making sure that it dovetails in things like defect warranties and so on. Also that it fits in with the implementation contract on flow down of issues such as change in law, and the PPA on curtailment and outages, and any important aspects of the finance term sheet, such as the term of the debt and so on, and any other specific lender requirements. Generally, we took a similar approach to the one that was taken in the other contracts, so an innovative and balanced approach. I think really trying to look at driving some of the cost and the kind of overly heavily risk allocation that you can get in some of these solar project contracts. A good example of that, I think, is a recommended approach we've taken on spares, where we've suggested that you shouldn't ask the contractor to take a full wrap price on spares, but actually only include certain specific spare parts replenishment in its price. We also asked for just a PCG rather than a bank bond, and an availability guarantee rather than a performance bond. As Jean-Pascal said, we've been working very closely with SolarPower Europe on the O&M best practice guidelines, and we've been through the latest version of those, and to make sure that the two are consistent, and that the best practice guidelines certainly do take into account and reference the positions we've taken on some of these key points, such as whether the approach taken on spare parts, parent company guarantee, and availability guarantee, and so on. And we're we're hosting at the Bird and Bird offices the event that Jean-Pascal mentioned on the 5th of December is being hosted at the Bird and Bird offices on the 5th of December. So we'd love to see you there to discuss these issues more.
Thank you, Lizzie, for first your comments, and also for hosting the SolarPower Europe event. I think Bird and Bird has made a very strong name now in the industry on OEM, and I'm sure that as well as Reed Smith, you will be also very happy and suited to advise and to help the members of SolarPower Europe to use and negotiate the contracts with their counterparties. It's a little more than 3 CET now, and Lorena, do we have questions from the audience?
Hello, Jean-Pascal. We don't have any questions from the audience. Thank you.
So I guess we have been either we have been terribly boring, or we have been absolutely crystal clear. I would tend for the second option, obviously. But if there are no further questions, I would like to just turn the floor to Mate for the final words on behalf of SolarPower Europe. And I would like again to thank all of you who participating to this webinar, as well as the Mate and Lorena on SolarPower Europe, and our panelists for making this webinar possible, and more broadly for making this initiative possible. Thank you very much. Mate, to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal, and also thanks a lot to all the speakers and panelists on behalf of SolarPower Europe. Thank you, Jean-Pascal. Thanks to Serkan from IRENA. Thanks to Lizzie from Bird and Bird. To Bree from Reed Smith, and thanks Stefano from ENI, the chair of our emerging markets task force, for this excellent input, these crystal clear presentations, and Jean-Pascal put it. And we will be working closely with the Terrawatt Initiative and IRENA in the future to further improve conditions and facilitate solar project development around the world. And hope to see you soon. See you in future webinars organized by SolarPower Europe. And please consider attending our O&M event in December, where we will have a dedicated session on the open solar contracts, and specifically the O&M template contract. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.